Okay, let's start our meeting. So, uh, Dear distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, good afternoon from Shanghai. Please first allow me to extend my warm welcome to you all for joining the ninth session of APRU Sustainable City and Landscape live webinar series themed with urban landscape diversity. Welcome. I'm Shengquan Che, the representative of the Executive Council of APRU Sustainable City and Landscape Program. I was from Shanghai Jiao Tong University School of Design. This session is hosted by my colleague, Dr. Fei Mo, and I. Fei is the SCL Urban Landscape Biodiversity Working Group leader, and she will take over the Q&A session. So in the beginning of the webinar, I would like to express my thanks to everyone worked to prepare this session. Christina and Tina from the APRU headquarters, Yekang and Grace from the SCL program. Our speakers are Alessandra, Harina, and Rishan. So Shanghai Jiao Tong University has always been committed to the core value of APRU to address on climate change, supporting diversity, inclusion, and minority, along with a network of the leading universities. The APRU Sustainable City and Landscape Hub, hosted by the University of Oregon, aimed to unite policy makers, researchers, and practitioners from across discipline to find answers to vital social, urban, and ecological questions of our time. So under this platform, Shanghai Jiao Tong University initiated the Urban Landscape Biodiversity Working Group, which is committed to promoting cooperation in urban landscape protection and biodiversity enhancement in the Pacific Rim. So next, please allow me to introduce our distinguished guest. They are Christina Shileb, APRU Senior Director, Policy and Research Program. Yekang Kong, Associate Professor at the Landscape Architecture, University of Oregon, APRU SCL Program Director. Alessandra Osala, Assistant Professor in Urban Science at the University of California, Davis. Harini Najendra, Professor and Leader, Center for Climate Change and Sustainability, Azim Permija University, Rishan Chen, a Professor of Landscape Architecture, Shanghai Jiao Tong School of Design. So let's first welcome Christina to give opening remarks. Please, Christina.
Thank you very much, Professor Che, for the introduction. Good morning, dear colleagues. My name is Christina Schönleber. As you just heard, I'm Senior Director of Policy and Research Programs at APRU. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to give a brief welcome and introduction to our first webinar kickstarting this new calendar year. As you all know, cities have become a potent force to drive and shape economic growth, development, and prosperity. And at the same time, cities are also drivers of innovation, consumption, and investment. And as such, they can have a devastating effect on ecosystem services. And this can be specifically applicable here in our Asia-Pacific region, with Asia accounting for nearly a third of world economic output and with the highest number of people living in urban areas. And at the same time, cities depend on healthy natural environments and healthy ecosystem services that are underpinning nature-based solutions. Now, ecosystem services are also key drivers to combat the effects of unabated urban development, such as air and water pollution and water shortages, just to name a few. But they're also essential for the well-being of people, and they enable cities to successfully adapt and become resilient to the impacts of climate change. Now, enhancing urban biodiversity is a key element for this to happen. Thus, I'm really, truly very excited to welcome our latest working group on urban landscape biodiversity to the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscape Program, led, as has just been mentioned by the professor, by Dr. Fei Mo from Shanghai Jiao Tong University, which is also the host of today's webinar. So alongside today's webinar, I'm really very much looking forward to future opportunities for further discussions and exchanges of insights with our experts and external partners, how we as a network of leading universities and experts can turn the tide on further biodiversity loss in the Asia-Pacific region, as well as globally. And with this brief introduction, I will now pass over to Dr. Yikang Ko, the director of the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscape Program, to officially open the webinar. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Christina. So then let's welcome Yikang Ko to give opening remarks. Please, over to you, Yikang.
Thank you, Dr. Che and Christina. Let me share my screen. My name is Yikang Ko, Program Director of the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub, and Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Oregon. Before we get started today's webinar, I just want to mention a couple of things about APRU and our Sustainable Cities and Landscapes program. So for those of you who are not familiar with APRU, first of all, APRU is the Association of Pacific Rim Universities. It's a network of 60 leading universities linking the Americas, Asia, and Australasia. We leverage collective education and research capabilities of our members into international public policy process. The Sustainable Cities and Landscapes program is one of the APRU's primary research programs. We collaborate on effective solutions to the challenges of the 21st century. So SCL Hub has 19 core members universities across the Pacific Rim, and the hub is housed at the University of Oregon. The SCL Hub successfully held 4 annual conferences, first in Portland in 2017 and Hong Kong in 2018, then Sydney, Australia in 2019, and Auckland in New Zealand virtually in 2020. And each conference offered various activities that students can participate in, and such as research working groups and design field school, and student design competitions and research symposium for PhD students. So this year, instead of our annual conference, we offer, from last year, 2021, we offer a live webinar series organized by our working groups and celebrating our 5th year. So, and all the previous webinars, and including this one, will be recorded and available on the APRU SCL webinar series webpage. And our next webinar will be hosted by Professor Natalie H. Berry from the University of Hong Kong at 9:30 a.m. on January 27th in Hong Kong time. So this webinar engages with the dynamics of intertidal zones and their human and non-human inhabitants in 2 distinct regions along the Pacific Rim. So first, Hong Kong at the edge of the Pearl River Delta and the Gulf Triabaga, an area in the Pacific coast of Colombia. And the presentations will address the issues related to the social cultural practice of communities living in these landscapes and review ecological engineering strategies for regenerating hard coastal edges, and discuss the pedagogical methods that are cultivating rich design education through engagement with the intertidal zone. And lastly, one exciting news for SCL Hub is this forthcoming Routledge Handbook of Sustainable Cities and Landscapes in the Pacific Rim. And they will introduced a handbook to explore the new ways of understanding sustainable cities and landscapes. And the handbook includes over 60 case studies across the Pacific Rim and 64 chapters contributed by 116 authors from 38 institutions across the Pacific Rim. So this book will be published in a month. So please, looking forward to this publication. And I hope you continue to join us and explore how cities and regions across the Pacific Rim address climate change and social equity to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And please contact us through email and visit our website, Facebook, or Instagram if you are interested in participating in our activities. And thank you, and yeah, enjoy today's webinar. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yekan. Thank you, Yekan. Urban landscape is significant to the majority of the population who live in the city of the world. There has been a rising recognition that biodiversity is a foundation of the healthy ecosystem. But how to associate urban landscape transformation and planning and design to biodiversity conservation has been a challenge to realize sustainable development at the global scale. This webinar talking on how to use nature-based solutions, climate change adaptation, biodiversity assessment, human-nature relationship management, and co-creation to promote sustainable urban landscape development and biodiversity conservation. There will be 3 presentations focusing different aspects of urban landscape biodiversity, and a free discussion afterwards. Let's please welcome Alessandro Alsala from UC Davis to give his presentation. Alessandro's research encompassed several topics, including ecology, climate change, forestry, water management, food production, planning and design. His talking title is Global Changes and Opportunities for Urban Biodiversity. He will explore recent retreats in urban biodiversity research with particular focus on nature-based solution, biological conservation, and climate change adaptation to highlight challenges and opportunities for urban planning, design, and management, and also for landscape design and planning. So welcome, Alessandra.
Thank you, Professor Chen. I'm going to share my screen now. Thank you for having me today. It's exciting to talk to you. So thank you for the introduction. I'm an assistant professor at University of California, and I'm the lead of our urban science lab. But I'm also an honorary research fellow at University of Melbourne and Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Today I want to explain and try to have an overview of what are the global challenges and opportunities for urban biodiversity that I see from my point of view. And I want to share my ideas so you can think about your own cities and try to understand whether these challenges and opportunities are similar. So we know from the literature that some cities are diverse, they are biodiverse, and my title is Yes, No, and Maybe. There is evidence that suggests that many cities can host diverse assemblages of plants and animals, and sometimes even common species. However, those cities themselves can be a cause of biological extinction and collapse. There is a very famous paper by Karen Sato maybe 10 years ago now, demonstrating that globally we're going to be losing 1% of our biodiversity hotspots because of urbanization in the next 10 years. So the cities itself can be a challenging topic when we talk about biodiversity within and outside cities. We know from the literature, though, that we are doing a good job. There is a very high research interest in this number of publications related to animals and plants published historically. As you see, they are spiking up. So the research community globally is very active, and with Arini and many other people, we are doing a fantastic job in trying to understand what are the patterns about global urban biodiversity. We know that urban biodiversity is important for cities to function ecologically. There is a lot of evidence out there. So we know that we can use plants and facilitate their performance by coupling them in plantings. We know that we can improve plant health and aesthetics by coupling different species together. Some species have synergistics relationships to each other. So, for example, one plant can deter some natural enemies from other plants. So if we plant plants that have these complementary characteristics, we can essentially improve the function of our landscapes. Of course, plants are not just above ground, they're also below ground. So we can couple plants with different traits, so we can maximize the plant-soil interactions, and therefore we can lower the maintenance that we do in our landscapes. But also we can increase diversity, and based on the biodiversity function theory, we can try to achieve a higher resilience to stress, or ecological stress. Finally, if we want to decrease the competition that plants have for resources, we can actually couple plants that have different niches. So we separate plants. One plant is using more phosphorus, one other plant is using more nitrogen, and we can couple these plants to maximize the opportunities for that. So we know all of that. So the ecology is kind of getting settled. However, cities are made of people as well. So there is burgeoning amount of literature demonstrating that urban nature is important for people. So during COVID-19, actually, we got stuck at home ourselves. So we couldn't do much but checking Google Trends. And actually, we searched globally the term gardening, translated in all these different languages here on the left-hand side. So what we were able to demonstrate in a new paper just published in December is that there was a synchrony between the peak of infection of the first COVID-19 wave on the horizontal axis in the different countries, and the peak of interest in gardening as we measure online. You can see that there is a very strong relationship. As soon as countries were going into the lockdowns and quarantines and all of that, people were stuck at home and they were resorting to gardening to be able to cope with this crazy period that everybody of us experienced. So we know that urban nature is important, and this has been always like that, but we actually measured the responses of people in a global survey of about 4,000 people. And so unsurprisingly, what we found was that the connection to nature was extremely important, was the most important factor drawing people to garden during COVID-19. So this is extremely important, and actually remind me of a quote on the foreword of this book that we wrote 3 or 4 years ago now, from the Director General of WWF International, who wrote the foreword of this book. And he wrote that the more people are able to learn and experience nature and biodiversity, even in the simplest and most urbanized form, the more chances we have to build a community of practice that supports the change that we need to build a future where people and nature are finally able to coexist in harmony. Cities designed to keep us apart from wild nature can in fact turn out to be our greatest allies for environmental education and conservation. So rereading this forward, I actually felt that in a way all the pieces of the puzzle are coming together, and finally we are recognizing that we have the historical opportunity to change our cities for the better, for people and nature together. Of course, all the cities are different, so I want you to think how urban biodiversity and nature fare in your city or town. Are they valued, and by who? Every city is somehow different. There is no single universal rule of what a city is. And that's the beauty of urbanization, where we have different natures, we have different climates, we have different people, different societies. So we need to understand how to make generalizations, but in a local context. And this is a research challenge that we haven't really figured out yet. It's important though to understand that this is not new. We have been doing urban biodiversity research really for millennia. These are some examples from different artistic pieces of art. And we can see that, whether it was in central Mexico or in Europe or in some parts of Asia, we were dealing with urban biodiversity millennia ago. We were tending plants and, sometimes animals for our own sake, but there was a sort of harmony and codependence between people and nature already. So we just need to rediscover how to do it with a modern lens. So fast forward, a couple of thousand years, now we have technology. And I want you to introduce to our global urban tree inventory that has been released 1 year ago. In this work, we essentially surveyed tree inventories in more than 370 cities and towns globally. We collected a huge data set of 13 million records because we wanted to know which tree species have been planted in all these urban areas historically to create biodiversity. There is no information out there yet. So we were able to find that actually our cities host an incredible diversity. We have 4,734 recorded species, which is about 7.8% of the global tree flora known to exist. And projections that we did, we actually estimate that this percentage might go up to 15% of the entire tree flora known to exist. So it's a huge diversity that historically we brought in our cities, and we are still, tending it. We look at all these different countries and continents and urban areas. We had a climatically balanced sample size to avoid, oversampling some cities in some climates, for example. So to try to reduce bias in our sampling, we did essentially a particular selection. We also found that, however, we have 327 species that are potentially invasive that we need to take care of, and that might be a problem. But also a lot of species that are critically endangered based on IUCN's red list of threatened species. So if you want to check it out for yourself, you can just go to this link. This is a data set you can freely download and play around with and check out whether your city is there, so you can actually see how your city compares with the global cities. I want to note that in this data set, we found 6 species that are extinct in the wild, and they are still grown in our cities. So it's extremely important to understand how you, in your practice and in your job, as soon as you land your job, if you're a student, how you can use your practice to be able to help conservation biology. Can we use cities as botanic gardens, as arboreta, to be able to save the species? We need to change the narrative of how cities are thought. They are not anymore a locus of extinction. They can be where we save our species, but just need to have bold ideas and bold programs of how to do that. Another topic I want to touch briefly is climate change. And here, an example of the climate niche, so mean annual precipitation on top and temperature at the bottom, between essentially natural and urban in two different colors, or this particular species, which is an Australian tree species, Alocagerina. As you can see here, the niche, the urban niche is relatively different from the natural niche. So if we consider though a similar species, which is this species, you can see that the urban niche is perfectly matched to the natural niche. What is telling me this graph is that for Alocagerina tolorosa, that currently lives in drier and colder urban areas compared to the native environment, we can actually try to plant this species in hotter and wetter cities, because the natural niche is telling me that that species should be able to survive. So why not using species in the right place? This is a similar example I just pulled out from one of my PhD student, Ronnie, who's currently completing in Australia his PhD on bioclimatic modeling of tree species. Quercus dentata is a species that some of you might be familiar. It comes from China, Japan, and Korea, and it's been planted elsewhere in the world. And you can see from this animation that essentially the niche, the climate niche of the urban climate niche in red is significantly different from the native climate niche in green, and there is only a tiny overlap. So some species are plastic. They can be adapted to live in climates that they never experienced before. And so we need to understand what is the sweet spot between being able to push plants towards their limit and being able for them to be successful. Here, another example from Australia, Pongamia pinnata, which is the Indian beech. As you can see here, the distribution of this species in 2030 and 2070 will be expanding along the southern edge, the eastern edge of the continent, and it will be suitable to be grown and planted in more and more urban areas in the south. So we deem this as a low climatic risk species. However, if we took like this lily pilly, you can see clearly that the distribution in the future is going to shrink. So this species is going to be struggling under recurrent heat waves and drought. So we deem this as a high climate risk species. Another question for you. What are the challenges and opportunities for urban biodiversity and nature in your city? So I want to pose you three challenges and opportunities at the same time in my next slides, and then I'm going to conclude. But of course, these might not be applicable to your particular context. So when you go home, try to think about it. Maybe it doesn't make sense, maybe it makes sense. And if it makes sense, think what you can actually do to improve the situation in your own city. So the first challenge for us is how we integrate diversity into other urban solutions that are generally referred as technological solutions and social solutions. In this paper from last year, we pitched the idea that we need to get to the common point of these three different spheres. Integrated solutions are by definition the best solutions because they are redundant and they have greater safety margin, they can ensure greater resilience for our nature, because if, for example, there is species that need to be irrigated and you don't have a social construct in place for irrigation or a technical solution for irrigation, then your nature-based solution might fail in the first place. So we need to understand how we get there. And I'm not saying that it's easy, and in fact it's not. But for example, this is a case from Boston where I make the case for the integration between ecological solution and social solution. In Boston, we tested this spatial contagion theory or neighbors mimicry. I make it this example where, let's say that you are here and this is your neighbor, and that's your neighbor of your neighbor, and that's your neighbor of your neighbor, and so on. You get the idea that you have different degrees of separation between you and your neighbors. In Boston, what we measure across the entire city of Boston was that either for tree canopy cover on the left, tree canopy height or turf cover, you see that the autocorrelation decreases as long as you go from neighbor to neighbor to neighbor. So these graphs, you don't need to look at the details, but what can we say here is that after the fifth neighbor, the power of mimicry decreases. So if we want to establish, for example, policies that are leveraging people interactions to do the right thing, for example, plant a tree or plant more biodiversity gardens and so on, we can use these social mechanisms up to a certain spatial point, which is in this case 5 degrees of separation between you and your neighbors. So we can use data to inform this type of planning, and we need to understand whether this is only a thing that is happening in Boston or is happening, somewhere else in Shanghai or in Auckland or so on. My final point is about a concept, which is the concept of climate safety management. So we know from basic climate science that, based on a particular temperature in a particular area, you have a maximum temperatures. Species with particular niches might have, in green, some safety margins, so it's all good. However, when climate change is happening, a hotter climate might push some of these species beyond the maximum temperature range, so they might fail. So what do we do here? Well, the idea is, again, playing with diversity. So if we increase the number of species and we have species with higher safety margins, or we have ecological processes with higher safety margins, we can increase the redundancy of our system and our landscapes. And the same thing is applicable to infrastructures and governance and policies and so on. So we can compound safety by playing smart. And overall, we can increase the safety, the climatic safety of our nature-based solution overall. Finally, a brief touch about technology. We all are familiar with all these different terms and drones and all of that, which is great, but we need positive technology for urban biodiversity. This is a case study that we did with Sydney Water recently. It's under revision. But in Sydney, we have 651 species of trees planted across the city, which is an amazing diversity. It's actually one of the highest diversities in the world. But trees are intruding sewer pipes and they are causing $10 million damage to Sydney Water every year. So here we use big data and artificial intelligence to predict which tree species were more likely to essentially intrude pipes. For example, ficuses, callistemons, melaleucas, and so on from this graph. So we need to have a positive technology and ideas to be able to help biodiversity to stick around with us in the future. And with that, I want to thank you, some of our funders. I want to thank you, Dr. Mo and Professor Shen, also for the invitation to contribute today. And I'm looking forward to your questions later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alessandra. Next, Professor Harini Najendra will bring on her thinkings about Indian cities, rapid urban landscape changes in India from an ecological view. Professor Harina is an ecologist and a professor of sustainability. Over the past 25 years, she has been at the leading edge of research examining conservation in forestry and cities of South Asia from the perspective of both landscape ecology and social justice. So Harina, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Professor Che, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and I look forward to learning more about the program as well during future conversations. So welcome to everyone. I think if there is a silver lining of the past, what we have been through in the past 2 years, it is the fact that conversations like this are now possible, and I enjoyed Alessandra's talk and looking forward to Rishan's talk and learning more about the work. So I think we can connect from different parts of the world, which is very nice. So I'm going to share with everyone today some of the journeys we've been doing in India, where I've been working on forests for a long time, but my urban work has been going since 2006. And really the idea started with so I'm originally an ecologist who looks at forests, but I started realizing, looking at my own city, Bangalore, that one needs to start understanding how ecology changes in cities and urban areas, because most of us who do research live in cities. And so if there's one place we can actually fix, being the locus of where we work and where we're part of the society, that's cities. But yet thinking ecologically about cities is not something people do. There are a lot of very good urban theorists, and they don't think about ecology as being part of a city's culture, a city's environment, a city's sustainability. And there are a lot of great ecologists who don't look at cities because we want to look at pristine habitats and have this wilderness bias. Right? So thinking ecologically about cities is something that is now growing. It's very nice to see so many young people part of this webinar, but it's very new in some sense. And we need to understand in the last 20, 30 years, how has this field grown and how can we contribute? So of course, I think many of you know this, that we're already a world that is more than 50% urban. And by 2050, we are going to be a world that is more than 75% urban. But what is interesting is if you look at this UN chart, for instance, you will see that some of the fastest urbanizing countries in the world are India, China, Nigeria, parts of Latin America, places that are not historically what one would have thought of as urbanized. Again, giving you a nightlight satellite image from 2012 to 2026, you can see, for instance, in India, you have blue areas which are lights on, whereas many parts of the US, many parts of Europe have lights out. They're sort of de-urbanizing in very large parts, whereas many parts of Africa, different parts of Asia are really growing very fast. Now, urbanization in countries like India and of course in China, very different from a Western or a global North context, because the densities of people are so large and the kind of nature-society interactions are very different. We did a paper in Nature Sustainability where we looked at this across what we call the Global South or developing countries or the Eastern nations, however you want to define them. And they have had historically higher rates of urban growth, not just now, but even in the 1970s. So cities in contexts like India grow very fast. They have very different environmental and social parameters, different rates of access to water and sanitation, different rates of access to the internet, different levels of homicide, different rates of youth unemployment, different rates of air pollution. And yet, if you look at the fact that all this data tells you very clearly that it's a very different context in the global North and the global South. But if you look at, we then did a study where in the same paper, we looked at the top 1,000 papers. When I say top 1,000, the most cited 1,000 papers in a decade of work on urban sustainability. A lot of it is urban ecology, of course. And you see that most of it is dominated by North America and Europe. 20% of papers come from China. And then if you look at the other global South, India, for instance, contributes 10 out of 1,000 of the top cited papers, South Africa 7, and the other global South 27. So contexts like Indian cities, maybe 0.5% of the data from good papers comes from this context. And therefore, it's not a surprise that we have urban theory on urban ecology, on urban sustainability, which is driven by studies in contexts which are completely different from the Indian context. This theory then shapes methods of inquiry and then influences practice and planning. Now, how does it do so? I'll give you one beginning example. So for instance, urban transects are something routinely you will see urban ecology scholars do. You start with a transect, go from the center of the city to the periphery and look at some index of change, whether it's urban tree density, it's biodiversity, it's something else. But in cities like India, you have cities that swallowed to include villages. So often you have villages inside cities, and I'll show you some examples. And then you have areas that are out in rural settings where wealthy people have gone and bought areas and converted them to high rises. So you have cities in rural environments and you have villages in the city. And therefore what you have is a very patchy, spatially disconnected environment which does not fit. So for instance, we did some work in Bangalore, where we looked at 3 different areas, the core center of the city. So the city from the 1600s, which is when it was first, the 16th century, when it was first built, so to speak. And then a city from the next string, and finally a city from the outermost string, which got urbanized maybe 40, 50 years ago. This is a photograph from the heart of the city, Domlur, one of the oldest areas of the city, which has inscriptions which indicate that it was populated in somewhere in the 12th or 13th century. Right? This is the heart of the city, and yet you still find areas that look like a farmhouse, that have cows, that have pigs, that practice a very rural lifestyle next to the old airport of the city, next to 5-star hotels, next to malls, next to very glitzy places. You also find this is the heart of the market town of the city, which was the area that was constructed in 1537. A goddess, this is the plague goddess, you know, and this is there's a temple, and people go here to worship, and you have sacred nature at the heart of the city. So we compared these, you know, the old urban and the new urban, an area that was in using old maps, and we find that there's not too much difference in the urban structure. There is not difference in the urban ecology, and it really depends. The structure is very patchy. So a gradient transect approach would fail if you started looking at this, just because of the ways these cities are constructed, with cities expanding to engulf areas that are still very rural in their livelihood, in their lifestyle, in their ways of thinking. And yet it is still so common. You find so many people coming to research Indian cities, many of the African cities, many Latin American cities using this approach, and it does not work. Another example would be the relationships with urban nature. Again, if you look at African cities and South Asian cities, there is an intimate approach to urban nature. So for instance, you might find the gentleman above in the top left picture, who I found taking a walk in the morning and stopping to pray near a tree. Or the children here using the tree as their playground and making swings from old saris. So they're playing there. It's an informal settlement where the parents have gone to work, the children play under the tree. Or commercial launderers who use lakes to wash clothes in this heart of the city, or this man who is grazing his cows in the heart of the city. Cows are very important for Indian lakes because these, you know, many of these cities expand without urban infrastructure. So you don't have the sewage networks that support the treatment of sewage in sewage treatment plants. And therefore, a lot of these effluents, including domestic sewage, flow into the lake and lead to eutrophication of the kind you can see in this water body. But you have cows, and they do grazing, and they come and eat that, and you get organic milk. And when, on the other hand, you forget about this relationship with nature, you lead to very abnormal prescriptions of how to fix this. For instance, in Bangalore, you have inscriptions on stone and copper plates from the 5th century. And they talk about a very beautiful concept of nature, which says that any survey of land, these are land survey documents, include the wells underground and the trees overground. So our ancient settlers knew what we have forgotten, that the wells underground provide the life-giving water and the trees overground provide the life-giving shade, and should be part of any survey document, which we don't do nowadays, you know, because we have a British colonial system of land records. The motivations, many of these water bodies or lakes were created by people for the service of the goddess, for the service of animals, cattle, birds, for dharma or righteousness to be to the world, to be for future generations of their families, to obtain merit in the afterlife. And these were common people. You have, for instance, a lake in Bangalore, which is called Suli Kunten. Suli in Kannada means a prostitute. So you have all kinds of people who, through incredible sacrifices, created, you know, money which they donated to the community for upkeep and development. And unfortunately, we've forgotten this history because of the kinds of research that we have. Lake restoration now in Bangalore is fueled by the idea of smart cities and nature-based services, which completely forget that there is this intimate relationship to the environment that local communities had, that these were community-maintained lakes. So the first thing they do is separate the lakes from the erstwhile villages around them by fencing the lake to keep out the cows. And then you get eutrophication. And then you spend a lot of money taking people and boats in to pull out the weeds. They exclude all kinds of common uses. There are no grazers, there's no commercial laundry, there is no, there used to be a lot of foraging for a number of, 100 different varieties of grains that we've shown harvested here, which support local nutrition, but all of this is excluded. And so if you look at, and there are a number of examples, I'm just giving you these two examples of the gradient approach and then the lake protection approach to tell you that we need context-specific research if you want to connect to practice, design, and education. Global studies are incredibly useful. They give you ideas what to look at, and then you need to see what works in your own context. And so a lot of what we've been doing is practice-based research. So for instance, one of the things we've been struggling with in Indian cities is when you have such high rates of migration, how do you make sure that people actually care about their environment, that want to protect it? We found that newly restored lakes are nodes of what we call environmental placemaking, because when you are here, you might be a migrant from a different city, you might be a village resident and your area has changed around you, you might be a transgender community, you could be special parents of special needs children. People come here to the lake, they find a place of peace and satisfaction, and they build connections to that environment. We also find implications for design. Women forage in the city, and we found low-income women from low-income homes in the heart of the city forage for over 80 different species of greens, and they know what is useful for joint pain, what is useful for making your hair grow well, what is useful for the common cough and cold. And there are markets that sell these, and these women forage. So we need different, what does this tell us? We need different ways of planning our city so that we don't have just landscape parks. Our research has shown that 80% of the species planted in parks are exotic. And what we really need are rewilded parks where women like this can not just forage, but take people like us on walks to understand how to improve our own nutritional diversity. And of course, this has implications for urban justice, for migrants, for low-income communities to forage and live off the land. We've also tried to put some of these into documents that we use for education. For instance, a very successful bilingual Kannada-English book that we created for children is based on work we've done around groves. And now 6,500 print copies of these are in village libraries across the state of Karnataka, along with a teaching aid, a bilingual teaching aid, which tells teachers how to get students out into the environment and make these connections. So you can learn physics or mathematics or biology by sitting under a tree. And that connect that you get from the environment then is supposed to feed into the state's rural employment guarantee program. So you create more groves like this, generate employment, create education, right? So this is the kind of work that we've been doing. We also look at other cities and, so high tech to very local, looking at classifications of Indian cities using Google Earth Engine and looking at the 10 largest cities. And what this tells us is that different cities have very different histories. So for instance, Bangalore is a colonial city, and therefore tree cover is very high at the center of the city because it has the British colonial old army establishments, which are very wooded now with a lot of exotic species, but very wooded. But cities like Mumbai, for instance, because they have the coastline and they're very linear, they've grown along the have a very different relationship with water, with agriculture, with trees, where it goes down and then it comes up, the tree cover again peaks as you start going from Mumbai to closer cities. And so when you plan Mumbai and Bangalore, you need to plan them very differently because they come with different histories, they have different social ecological settings. So again, a one-size-fits-all approach to urban ecological planning will not work. And so I'd just like to end with this, that we need an urban theory of sustainable cities for India, which is driven by work on India. And of course, this is true for contexts across the world. We don't need a world where only 0.1% of the research comes from India, but we're driven by 99.9% of the research that does not fit our context. And then we need to see how this urban theory, like ideas of environmental placemaking, can feed into practice, planning, and education. These are some examples, for instance, of books that we have published for the public and for wider audiences, which are used now by architects, by engineering students, by media people, by schools for classes, and a children's book, which is also being published very soon, called So Many Leaves, which is now in 6 languages, including Alessandro Italian, because this is a commons network, and so people can download this for free, translate it for free. So it would be very nice to see if other people want to translate it to different contexts. With that, I'll stop, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Harini. Now let's welcome Professor Ruishan Chen, my colleague from the Shanghai Jiaotong School of Design. Ruishan is a geographer and a professor of the human-environmental interaction. Over the past 14 years, he has been working on land use change, urban disaster risk reduction, climate change, and coastal land reclamation. Recently, he is combining adaptation and mitigation measures through landscape and nature-based solution to achieve carbon neutral and resilient city. He is working as a shepherd of for UCCRN's climate change, COVID, and cities, and lead author for nature-based solutions in cities. He will be sharing his point of view on urban biodiversity. Over to you, Professor Ruishan.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I think it is very, I'm a very pleasure to see the very good presentation from Harini and also Alexander. So today, I would like to talk about urban biodiversity in the Anthropocene. So I think, my background is geography. So most of our work is looking from the geography aspect. So, okay, wait a minute. Yeah, today I would like to talk about this from three aspects. First, the Anthropocene at the cities. Secondly, from anthropogenic drivers, and the third from the urban biodiversity in the future. How to place the cities. We all know that Anthropocene, the cities will be the future. This is Shanghai. You will see, in the night that is very, very beautiful. But from a geography aspect, I would like to think, the Anthropocene that is very different from the other epochs in the geological epochs. So. We see the Anthropocene. We talk about the Anthropocene. This is the age of the humans. So in the geological history, the different life dominates the world in certain period. But now we know the world are dominated by the humans. Regarding the climate change, we already went out of the climate comfort zone. That is Holocene. Holocene epoch, but now we are coming into a very dangerous zone. We see a lot of climate extremes these days. Flood in China and also in the fire in US and a lot of other disasters. And we see the population and social economic and the environment are changed dramatically in the Anthropocene. Compared to 200 years ago. Especially, since the 1950s, with the very, very big change, very big shift, of all the population and also the ecosystems. And in 1990, there's only 5.3 billion population, in the city, in the world. At that time, the population living in the city is only 20%. And nowadays, we have more than 7 billion people. They on the world, and the more than 6 people, they are living in the urban areas. So, most of the people, most of the urban population in the 21st century, they will be added in Asia and Africa. So, as Harini just talked about India, also in China, I think these two countries are nearly the same. So, I have several students, PhD students from India. We are very happy to do a lot of compare studies between China and India, and how the cities address several challenges, the climate change and also the pollution and other things. This is Manhattan, in 400 years ago, that is totally covered by vegetation. And nowadays, if you look at Manhattan, that is totally high buildings. So this is a very dramatic shift, for for that city. But look at our city in Shanghai, in 1870s, like around just 130 years ago, the very, very, very busy street in Shanghai, that is the Nanking Road. In 100 years ago, that is still very traditional houses. Nowadays, we see very, very, high buildings, a lot of people there. Not only that part, if we look at the Lujiazhi area, in Shanghai, in 30 years ago, we see a lot of vegetation, still a lot of forest there. But nowadays, we see that is totally hierarchy buildings. And, so we are in the Anthropocene, we know a lot of, human forces, they already changed the biodiversity in the cities. So, in a recently published paper, summarized the current urban diversity change research. They look at it from several aspects, but today I would like to only look at the socioeconomic and socio-ecological drivers of the urban biodiversity change. Because from my background, I think I can address this aspect very well. So we know a lot of urban drivers will change the urban biodiversity. But mostly, the urban heat island, the light pollution, the noise pollution, and also land use and land climate change. The first one would be like the urban climate change. We even without climate change, we know the cities, the temperature between the urban area and the rural area, that they are different very much. But also, if we think about climate change, that will change the temperature in the cities. And if we think about, what that will affect the urban trees and also other wildlife, that will be a lot, for the flowers in the cities, the temperature change in the cities affects the urban diversity in a lot of ways, for like the first flowering date, the flowers, the first flower is the forest, the trees first have flowers. Also when the leaves falling, these dates are changed dramatically. All these years, like in some cities, the flower date, the first flower date will advance 5 days. In these cities. Also in some cities, the tree leaves, falling also postponed several days. So I think this, this will not only affect the biodiversity, but also will affect our health. For like people, somewhere is very sensitive to the flowers, so that will affect their health, and that will be a big change. So the second one is the light. We see in the night, a lot of cities is very bright. Like, the urban areas, is much brighter than the rural area, if we think about that. Because of urbanization, artificial light increased by around 2% per year globally. So that will affect a lot. Light pollution affects biodiversity in many ways. If we think about the communication between the birds, the animals, also the movement, the sleep, and the food, when they want to find the food, these are contributor, for the dramatic decline of certain migratory birds, some birds populations over the past several decades. So this will be the light is also, changes not only the wildlife, but also, for the human, that is a very, very big change. The third one is the noise. We don't like the noise. Also, the birds and the other wildlife, they also don't like the birds. But the noise, don't like the noise. The noise, in the cities. If we see, not only in US, also a lot of other countries, the cities have much higher noise than the rural areas. So this will also affect a lot, because, if the noise is more than higher than some threshold, we will feel very uncomfortable. So this is also the same for the birds and other animals in the cities. We see, the gray tit, that's a very good example, when, because of noise, this bird need to modify their sounds to find like mates, communicate with their mate, with their mates and others. So I think this is a, very big change for them. But also, the cities are great homogenized forces. Like, we see a lot of trees in cities, not only in China, but also in other countries. They are nearly the same. Like many universities and parks in China and also in, in the United States, you will see all of these, but on these trees, we can't see too many birds like squirrels and other animals. So that is because, we change the land cover, but also we change the tutor system. We are not only changing the, trees on the ground, but also we change the grass. We see the grass was changed, and also the soil and the biodiversity on the ground was changed. These pictures are all I took in China, in Shanghai. You see recently, we modify the tree morphology. We remove the tree leaves, in autumn on the ground. We also select the grass roots, so that means, they are very, they are not so diverse, in some places. And you already see this picture, that cover with this time, the presentation. And we see in urban parks, you will see the lawn and the flowers can be changed in different seasons, that you will see different seasons, we have different flowers because that was totally, arranged by the people. And also, in the different habitat, because of change of habitat, the neighborhood types and birds distribution, they are correlated, they have some correlations, for like, in some, the bird species richness also, have some relationship with the family income. If some family income is higher, because they have the, this is the example in US Baltimore, they have a good like a law, and then the species will, the bird species will be, much higher in richness. And also, the ponds, when the rural area change into urban area, you will see the ponds, they reduce the area, also they reduce the numbers. So this will have very big, big change for the aquatic wildlife, like the, a lot of frogs and others will change dramatically. The biggest change, I think, or maybe with pets, because in urban area people love the pets. This is a very powerful selective force. For alters the behavior, physiology, the morphology of the city dwelling animals. So like because we don't have data for other countries, but we have data for the UK, and Ireland. We see that. In Great Britain, we see more dogs in the cities, but the pets per household is higher in rural than in urban areas. And this is nearly the same, for the island, in Ireland, the distribution of pigs and cats, the dogs and cats in the urban area is much higher than in the rural area, but per household in the rural area is higher than in the urban area. We know dogs, we like dogs and cats, these pets, but actually they have the big impact for the biodiversity in the urban areas, not only in the urban areas, but globally, that these dogs and cats are considered the cause of more than half of the global extinction of birds, mammals, and reptile species. So this is a very big force, if we think about the biodiversity loss, in the century. And we see, they have several kind of, impacts like the predation, the disturbance, also disease transformation, all of this, like disease transmission, all of these kind of mechanisms. So, because of this, all these, dogs, cats, and, this kind of species, they have a big impact for the biodiversity loss. So totally, we see globally, like in China, we see more than 21%, 21 species were their loss was because of the dogs, domestic dogs. Given that if you think about the Earth's land area, the cities only occupy like 2% of the Earth's land area, but they consume 75% of the resources. So the urban diversity planning should be set broad inside to consider how the city's activities will affect the ecosystems, not only in the urban areas but also globally. So totally, because of all of these human forces, we see that the mammals, the birds, the mammals, and also the other kind of the wildlife, their species decreased a lot from several hundred ago to nowadays, especially nowadays in the, we talk about in the Anthropocene or from 1950s, the species extinction rate increased a lot. Only from 2000 to nowadays, only like 20 years, this rate has changed dramatically. And we said we would like to talk about urban diversity in the post-pandemic era, because before Alexandra already talked about the COVID-19 and the biodiversity relationship. So our life in the cities actually totally depend on the biodiversity. We need the biodiversity for food, for work, for recreation. Our this is the pictures, I think you can find in China and in other countries, the fruit we eat, like fruit, the meat, honey, and, we drink tea. So all of these, come from the biodiversity. And also, for the medicine, for the energy, for the ornamental materials, all of these come from the biodiversity. So we have a very tight connection with the wildlife. This, from the other side, not only the physical side, but also, our mental health is, dependent on the urban biodiversity, especially during the pandemic lockdown, people living near great species have less stress compared to the people live far away. So that means, the urban biodiversity have very good relationship for us, good impact for us. The IP-based, I think a lot of you already know IP-based, intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. I worked for the land degradation and restoration assessment, and also, they have two other assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the recent one is the IP-based workshop of biodiversity and pandemics. That one, summarized a lot where, the drivers and also the, potential pathways, potential transformations we can do to work on the urban biodiversity. The land use change and the agriculture expansion and the urbanization, they cause more than 13% of the emerging disease events. So that is a very big impact, if we think about that. And, when we talk about the future, we can expect escape from the pandemic era. Even, now overall, we are still, affected by the pandemic. But, this, if we want to, escape that era, we need to, require a much great focus on the prevention rather than just reaction. So we are not only dependent on the vaccines, but we also need to think about the other transformations, like this from we need to think about transform from the human wildlife conflict aspect to the harmonious coexist with the biodiversity in the cities. especially, before when we think about the cities, we think about, the city in the forest. But nowadays, more and more cities, they really think about the, the resilience. They need to think about, put the cities in the forest. And some cities, in the world, they already have biodiversity sensitive urban design planning. This is why from the Melbourne in Australia, they already have that kind of plan. So we also need to think about other, like as Randy just said, about the education side. The zoos and the museums, they are very good places to, to shape our consideration about the relation between humans and the wildlife. And nowadays, a lot of people talk about the carbon neutrality. If we think of carbon neutrality, we also need to think about the biodiversity, the green spaces in the city. We need a totally transformation, from the cities, the traditional cities to the cities, we can enjoy more green space, more diversity, all of these. Okay, thank you. This is my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ruishan. Now let's move to the discussion and the question session. And let me hand over to the host, to Dr. Fimo.
Okay, so many thanks to our speakers. Currently, we have about 20 minutes for questions and discussions. If any audience would like to ask any questions, could you just turn on your video and turn on your microphone, please? I think we have our postgraduate student, Anze. She is a PhD student from Shanghai Jiao Tong University. Would ask her first questions. Anze.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'm currently taking the PhD degree at Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and I took my master degree at the UniMel Burnley campus. So actually, I have enrolled in one of the lecture taken by Professor Steve Lapsley, and luckily Alexandra Osala has been one of the teaching assessment. So I'm very happy to hear his speech today. Actually, I have one question for him. Currently, we all know the low carbon is one of the key words in addressing the climate change. So I'd like ask him, so how do you reckon the counterbalance or the interaction between the low carbon and the urban biodiversity? Thank you.
So Anze,
Yes.
is your question specifically for which speaker?
For our first speaker, Professor Alexandra Osala.
Yeah. Alex, hello, hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for your question, and I'm happy to rejoin you after so many years, I guess. Yeah, like offsetting carbon in cities is tricky because cities are relatively small as a footprint and they don't sequester a lot of carbon. But we have a lot of potential to piggyback biodiversity, in particular trees, to offsetting carbon emissions. For example, in Australia, as you've been there, and in many other countries, we emit quite a lot of CO2 and other greenhouse gases for energy consumption, for example, to cool buildings during extreme heat events. So if buildings were shaded properly, for example, by using trees or other plants and different species of plants, we could actually determine quite a significant decrease of peak energy consumption during extreme weather events. So we could definitely use biodiversity in that sense.
So Anze, do you think Professor Alexandra already provide you sufficient information?
Yes, thank you. I'm wondering if I can have the further discussion after this conference with him, if he likes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just drop me an email.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So is there any other questions?
Hi, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's less of a question, but more, I guess, discussion for Harini. I I know I already put in the chat that I really like your presentation, but I feel like, especially in the field of landscape, no one ever brings in the discussion of like the discrepancy between like production of knowledge between the global north and the global south. And so I really like that you pointed that out. And I don't know, like, I mean, is there anything you would like to like bring up about like maybe how countries in the global south can operate and like really like, you know, like production of knowledge doesn't have to be so west centered on the West.
Thank you. I appreciate that a lot. One of the things I have learned so much, because I started working in urban landscapes more as a practitioner and as a resident and a community member, not as an academic. And so I think very differently about urban spaces than the forest spaces. And one of the things I learned is even my own city or my own locality, I can learn so much about it by talking to different people. So to me, one of the things that has been most influencing about the way we lead our spaces is to talk to people as unlike me as possible. You know, for instance, let's say a village resident from a local area, or a grazer, or a fisher, or a migrant worker. You know, when you look at the city through their eyes, then you see many things that we walk past. And I myself have learned so much about the use of a tree or the way in which a lake is important to them, which then feeds into our design and practice. You know, for instance, we started this work, and a lot of this is also dialogue with planners, I think, because planners come back to us with questions like, why is urban foraging important? Because in the city, no one forages. So we went out to prove them wrong with this survey of 200 women from the city, but we didn't expect that they would come up with more than 80 species for us. You know, so they proved us wrong on a scale that even I was not imagining. And then that fed into, okay, how do we, if you look at urban foraging, it is present in India and other cities, but it's by high-end chefs. It's like a master chef thing, how you forage and make your perfect organic beets and greens. But they're foraging in a very different way. These are daily recipes. So now we're trying to come up with a bilingual book, which is available free of charge for anyone, with the recipes, with the identification. And hopefully if we can get women like this to organize stores, it democratizes the transfer of knowledge again. You know, from them to us, and as opposed to from us sitting as academics to them. So
yeah, totally. Amen. I like that. I love that. Yeah, I notice, at least in the US, that like the sort of urban foraging that occurs is who I see is usually like, it's like the grandmas and the grandpas of like, you know, the immigrant families, or like in Seattle specifically, we have like we have this community garden called the Danny Wu Garden in the Chinatown, and it's mostly like the older generations and also lower income older people who use it, but yeah, very cool. I appreciate it.
Oh, hi. I think there is some comments from our chatting board, so all our experts can see it. And I just received a question from our colleague, Dr. Wan Peng. She would like to ask, what are the most challenges for urban biodiversity under climate change? Maybe this question we can hand it to Professor Chen. The question is, what are the most challenges for urban biodiversity under climate change?
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of changes, brought by the climate change. I think Harini is also a very good expert on that. When we think about the trees, in the spring, if the climate change, because the urban heat island, the trees, in the urban and the rural areas, they already have different flower time, But because of climate change, the urban trees, maybe they advance the first flowering date much earlier than the rural areas. And also, in the autumn, all these kind of not only trees but also the grass and other vegetations, they also can drop in their leaves very late, compared to to 100 years ago. So this will be a very, very big change, compared to compared to other time, as I said, Urbanisation and Holocene, before, So I think this will be a very, very big change, for the vegetation. The vegetation, as a wildlife, they also depend on the vegetation, for food, for others. If the vegetation, they change, the fruit, they come earlier or late, so that will also change the wildlife, the birds and others in the city. So I think this is a systematic change, not only, for certain species, but for all the species,
Okay, consider, thank you, Professor Chen. Thanks for the question. Consider how many minutes we have. We will have another 2 questions from our audience in our Zoom meeting room. The first one is some guest from the University of Malaya. The question is, what would be the best way to identify the suitable species for the purpose? Oh, sorry. What will be the best way to identify suitable species for the purpose, considering the abundance of species in this region and the complex ecosystem in urban areas? Well, I'm not sure who's the best to answer this question. Our speakers, I think Alexandra, would you give it a go?
If you want, I can give a go here. My suggestion will be, well, Malaysia is a very, biodiverse hotspot. So you have a lot of trees to play with, and the best way would be possibly to apply trait-based selection criteria, where you are not looking at particular species in the first place. You're looking at clusters of species with particular traits. For example, in your case, you might want, broad leaves and, a relatively high leaf area index. So you have different layers of leaves on top of each other. However, in tropical landscape, one of the problems that I was actually discussing with someone when last time I was in Singapore is that when you have too many trees during very, very hot days and the monsoon season, actually having too much of a canopy reduces the flash of air, and actually people are feeling worse because there is a lot of mugginess under the tree. So you really want to strike a balance between having shade and having a landscape that still allows for natural airflow, for the humidity to go away. So it's a tricky question, but I guess we can try it out.
Thank you, Alexandra. And we have, let me see, Noyo, sorry, I don't really know how to pronounce your name very correctly. But the question is there any special law for hunting in urban area? This one, I think, is good for Professor Ruishan Chen, because our audience directly point out questions for Professor Chen. Could you provide us some ideas if there's any special law for hunting in urban area?
Yeah, actually, for the hunting, they have hunting, they have laws for the, for national level. But for the urban level, especially in China, we don't have a very special law, for the hunting in the urban area. But we already have, some kind of a species, like wild birds, and others. We kind of hunting in, not only in the urban area, but also in the rural and other areas, So I think that because we have like some species, they are like first level protection species, second level species, So these kind of levels, they already, focus on the species. They don't focus on, the urban and rural area. So I think that will be, if that is already in the, endangered list, endangered species list, so you can't hunt that, in the urban and rural areas. So I understand this question, like maybe you think about some species like white birds, in the urban, maybe they are more dangerous than the rural areas. But still, I think for most of the countries, they don't have this kind of species law, they make a difference between the rural and the urban areas.
Okay, thank you, Professor
So
Chen.
maybe Harini and as Alexandra, some situations in other countries, if they have certain laws, specifically in the urban areas.
If our other two speakers have any comments to add on, could you also share with us some of your ideas? Otherwise, we will go for the last questions. Someone, Anna, right? Anna from Argentina. She said, it's very interesting to see urban-rural gradient in Indian cities. So this is quite similar situation in her country. She has a question about NDVI. Would ask all presenters the opinions about the use of NDVI and the NDBI measures, specifically your pros and cons as urbanization measures influencing urban biodiversity. So if I understand the question clearly, it's about speaker's opinion about using NDVI and NDBI to measure urbanization and how this affect urban biodiversity. Maybe we can go for Professor Harini first, and if our two other speakers have any further comments, we can add on. Harini, do you have any suggestions on this question?
Yes, because we've actually been using this in our Google Earth analysis. It's a very very good question. What we find is they are useful, but with caution, and we need seasonality along with these. So some of the places, for instance, is you might think that NDVI vigor is connected with more biodiversity because more trees. But when you have eutrophic lakes, as we have in the Indian city context, because of sewage flowing in, they look like very vigorous areas of, in fact, more vigorous in terms of NDVI than the tree areas, but the biodiversity is obviously very low because these are exotic species that have spread over the water body surface, right? It killed everything below. So yes, but with caution, but seasonality, using of seasonality, and what we find is using of temperature along with these is very useful, because temperature of, let's say, agricultural areas which are growing with certain seasons, combined with lake or water eutrophic and non-eutrophic areas, combined with tree areas and urban forests, that gives you a picture. So we are using seasonality in Google Earth Engine along with every month, the maximum NDVI and NDBI, along with temperature and other things. And that helps more than just looking at one index by itself.
Okay, so as the audience question is for three speakers, so if Alexandra and Professor Chen has any further comment on?
Yeah, for the NDVI, we did some work, for the urban areas like in Shanghai and in Nanjing. If we think about the vegetation, like the trees, along the two sides of the road, two sides of the street, you will see, because they have very big canopy, the road actually is covered by the vegetation. So actually, when you get the like a tree cover area from the NDVI, that will be much bigger than the actual area of the trees and the grass. I think we need to think about, as Hari just talk about, different seasons, they have different situations, but also maybe in some situations that is much bigger than the actual, the tree coverage.
I want to add one thing that we talk always about the trees, but you need to pay attention because there are many organisms, particularly insects, that, butterflies, for example, on top of my mind, they need open habitats, they need grassy landscapes. So if you don't have a landscape that has all the different combinations of resources that all the different biodiversity groups need, then you're only picking and choosing a subset and facilitating only a subset of species. In Melbourne, we found 12 species of butterflies, which is relatively low compared to, many of the cities where you guys are from. But they are all in grassy areas. So if you have trees, you're actually reducing your habitat, and trees are definitely greener than, a lawn. So you need to pay attention what type of biodiversity you want to facilitate.
Okay, so many thanks to our three speakers. As today is the first session of our urban landscape biodiversity working group. We are very welcome to all our audience and other, maybe other audience online who just join us through other platform to follow up other news from this working group. And today, many thanks goes to Christina and Ye Kang and also Grace, other colleagues from our international office, from the Department of Landscape, from the School of Design at Shanghai Jiao Tong University, who have helped to organize a session. If any of you have further questions to our speakers or would like to hear about the news from APRU and our working group, could you email me or just register our newsletters or something relevant channels to follow up our further progress. So Ye Kang, do you have any further comment?
Thank you so much for this really insightful presentation today. I personally also learned a lot and really eye-opening for how we can really also promote more place-based approach for increasing biodiversity in this era of climate change. And so, yeah, thank you so much for the hosting and all the speakers and audience. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Christina. Would you like to say something?
I would, yeah, sorry, I'd just like to say thank you again to all the speakers. Thank you to you, to Shanghai Jiao Tong for setting up this working group and for the program, the SCL program, for taking this forward and supporting it. It's such an important topic and really close to my heart. So I'm very excited about it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay. Many thanks goes to our audience as well. Many thanks for participating to this webinar. We will pronounce it other activities later. Professor Chu, could you kindly close the webinar?
Okay, I would like to express my really deeply appreciation for all three speakers. All of you make so wonderful information, knowledge, and creation for us. And also thanks for Tina from the APRU headquarters, Yang Kong from the SCL program, and for all the participants. So because the time is limited, but we just start our this platform, and we hope we have more cooperation from the research to education. Thank you all of you.
Yeah, okay. So maybe we just go to the end of today's session, and very nice to meet all of you here. Hope we can work out other things in the future together. So bye.
Yeah, I would like, invite Harini and Alexandra, when the pandemic is over, I hope you can visit our university. And, I also hope, if we can build some kind of collaboration, in research, in like a student exchange and other kind of, activities.
Absolutely.
And also, I would like to invite Christina and Yakao, when you have time, when it is available, you can visit our university. In person, not online.
Please. all of the colleagues, yes, thank you.
That
Yeah,
would be lovely.
exactly. Yeah.
So maybe we just hand it back to Grace again, because I think Grace is in charge of the Zoom conference. Yeah, and but many thanks for today's session. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye.